Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for our SRMA Teaching Series. Apologies for last week, but we're going to cover both last week's and this week's topic today. And today we're going to chat about screening and selection of articles for your SRMA and carrying out a risk of bias assessment. And delivering the session today is Niraj Kumar, who is the founder and president of NMRA. He's worked on over 50 projects. He's a current PhD student in cardiovascular science at the University of Leicester and a previous medic from University College London. Just to say, and many of you will know this, please fill in the feedback form to get your certificate of attendance, and I'll put it in the chat partway through the session for you. So thanks, Niraj, and I'll hand over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. So apologies again, everyone. We had a small emergency, so session 4 was cancelled. I won't go into the details of what happened, but essentially the doctor had something come up which was a lot more important than doing the teaching at the time. So because of that, I'm going to be doing both screening and risk of bias. I'll manage to squeeze them into hopefully about an hour, but apology if I do go over a little bit over. So that's the aim for today. We're going to be kind of getting through both in one. If there's, if you need to come back to anything or if there's any questions, obviously you have the recording, but as usual, you're more than welcome to get in touch. You're more than welcome to email through to me, and I will, happily answer any questions and solve anything that comes up. As usual, I like to kind of give people a bit of a background to NMRA. So if you are new to what we're up to, the NMRA is a non-profit. We launched in 2022, and we give students and young medics basically a chance to get themselves into a foundation to medical research. We want to give you guys an opportunity to get involved with we give you the training. We want to give you guys the mentorship program. Some of you guys will be here for that. We also offer networking. We offer other events for skill development. Essentially, by the end of a good year of involvement with NMRA, we hope to kind of develop people to become independent scientists. So by that, what I mean is you're able to conduct your own research studies and you're proficient with what you want to achieve in your goals in academia, provided that you're staying on top of all of that. I think that's a job well done from my end. Just also to the slides changing. Yeah, fine. Just to kind of follow up on where we're at with the academic series, I'm combining in screening and risk of bias. So that's sessions 4 and 5 on the left. But this is the overall agenda of what we're going to be doing for the next month and a bit. Essentially, we're going to be covering a start to stop and that work through of how to do a meta-analysis and systematic review type of literature. So we've already covered how to find a research question, a protocol, and a search strategy. And essentially, I'm going to be picking up from there with the assumption that you know how to find a search strategy that's relevant to your study. And then we're going to go through now what to do with that, how do you screen through the papers, and how can you be confident they're any good. Subsequently, we'll obviously go through how to extract relevant study information, how to do meta-analysis, how to write up a study, and then wrapping up, we'll talk about publication and how to get things through with peer review and submission. So in all, we will cover everything you need to know to be able to conduct a successful systematic review and be engaged at all the steps. If you're here for the mentorship program, I'm probably still interviewing you guys. So you'll be applying this in the coming weeks anyway. So just to get off with where we were. So in the previous sessions, we've kind of gone through about how to find a search strategy that's going to be appropriate for your research question. And then obviously you can search for that using suitable databases. I just want to kind of touch through some practical way of doing that. I'm going to attach a few screenshots and kind of show that to you so it's a bit more clear. I mean, he did a really good job of going through this stuff, but I think sometimes just seeing an example of it again after a while can help to refresh your memory and keep you on the right track. So on the screen now, which is coming up, is the layout from the database called Ovid. So that's essentially one of the main databases we use. It contains two of the biggest libraries that we'd use for systematic meta-analysis, namely Embase and Medline. They are basically commercialized and upgraded versions of what you'd find on PubMed. So it's essentially an enormous library of over 20 million different journals and papers, and it's very, very extensive. These go back to 1947, so most medical advances in the last 70 years are included in there already. But yeah, so the most straightforward thing you can do with this, and I think this will keep most people happy with where they are, is, so I've kind of logged in and I've clicked on the advanced search bracket, as you can see there. That's the one that's highlighted in bold. So that essentially is kind of, it allows you to tinker with like your Boolean terms and your search strategy, your mesh terms, which all of which Vafi's already covered in last session 2 weeks ago. So here you can literally just copy and paste your entire search strategy straight in, and that's just going to straight spit out all of your answers, which is probably the easiest way to do it. There's no mess. You can immediately get on with what you want to do. The only complication with that is obviously when you start to attach on these limitations. So there's stuff like full text, human, remove preprints. All of these things can seem to be really valuable, and they can be. But the issue is that sometimes an article that's in Ovid might not have been coded properly, or the metadata. So for context, metadata is basically the information that comes with the study about the study. So that might not have been coded properly. So sometimes something might be a full text, but there was no metadata telling Ovid that it's a full text study. So if you click that limitation, it might just remove it because the computer doesn't know that that's a full text. And there are errors like that built into the database because naturally it's got millions and millions of articles. It's not perfect. Things do get slipped through. So sometimes just be careful using limits. You might accidentally miss out something that might have been a really good paper. Sometimes it can be easier to just leave the limits and then tinker with that on like Excel, and you can filter through what you want yourself because you can see it with your own eyeballs. Sometimes that's a little bit easier, but I often think if you go for stuff like English language or full text, they're pretty generic, so it's never really a huge issue in terms of losing loads of relevant articles. The next thing that I think is really cool is if I click here on the search tools option, you can basically create a little map which will show you all the different relevant terms. So I put in asthma and it shows you all of these different things. You've got severe asthma, you've got asthma control tests, you've got a million types of different things that are relevant to asthma. And when you're building a search strategy and when you're building an extensive library of search terms that will help you doing stuff like this, you can then obviously navigate through that and you can pick out the ones that are most relevant to you. So that will ensure that you've not missed anything. It will ensure that you've got really good depth in your search strategy, and therefore you can be confident that you're getting all the articles you want. So that's really helpful. You might notice here there's this idea of exploding, which it kind of comes pre-ticked. Exploding is quite useful actually, because then it goes into all of these individual subheadings, which will load on the screen in a second. There we go. So that you can kind of see, it can help you to target the focus of your search. So obviously you might want to look at, for example, if you're looking at asthma in the context of, I don't know, epidemiology, you might want to click on EP here, or potentially you might be looking at it in the context of a side effect profile and, other complications, in which case you go for /SI here. Sometimes these can be useful because your study may belong in a certain niche. However, again, the same caveats apply. Things get miscoded, you might miss articles, and sometimes your study won't fit this precisely. So it's not gospel. You don't have to use it if you don't want to. You can just search through stuff yourself. That's completely fine. It's one of those things where at the start, especially if this is your first project, honestly, tinker around with stuff. Just play around with it, see how you get on. And you'll start to figure out what works for you, what level of control you're willing to do in terms of screening through stuff yourself, and how much you're willing to let the search kind of dictate, and how rigorous you want to be. There is a little bit of kind of personal element to that, I think, because there's no such thing as like a perfect way to do a search, and they're not all the same. If I came up with a search strategy for a paper and you did, we'd probably get drastically different results, just because we're going to put in different terms, we're going to do different things, and we're going to try a different approach. But that's completely normal. That's how it should be. Now, let's say you've done all of this, you've tinkered around with this, you've got all your papers. This is just the first page of the results that you'll get out of it. At the bottom, you literally just scroll down a little bit underneath the search part, and you get this. And then I've kind of helpfully arrowed it for you, but you want to go for the export page, and then you can export as a CSV file. So that's just delimited commas. Basically, it's just an Excel sheet, but simplified. Once you hit that, you can go into any reference manager of your choice. So I think a lot of people in research lately have been using Rayan. It's a really cool tool. It kind of allows you to just search through your papers very easily. It's got a lot of AI optimizations being added to it all the time. So it's very much kind of the up and coming reference management tool. Yeah, so that's a very quick kind of whistle top tour for like 5-10 minutes, just about going from having a search strategy and then just running that through a database. I've gone through Ovid. Obviously, you can use Scopus, PubMed, others. They're very, very similar. They're almost identical. There's nothing kind of profoundly different with them. I'm happy to go through others at a later date. If you need me to, just drop me a message, talk to me. We can cross that bridge. It's nothing massively complicated. But yeah, once you put it, and then yeah, so this is just an example of a review I've got ongoing in Rayan. It's literally just you feed in that CSV file, and you end up with, it just kind of creates like a little dashboard with all of the papers, and then you can just whittle through which ones you think are relevant, and you give them a judgment directly on the app, and it saves everything for you. And I think it can even kind of create all the information for a Prisma diagram for you. I'll go through that in a second. So it can be really helpful, because it can also, you can add your team on there, and multiple people can work on stuff at the same time, and it can track all of that, which is really helpful. Yeah, so it's great. To be honest, I am a bit lazy. I've gotten away with doing a lot of this stuff just directly on Excel. Just import the results out of Ovid and just directly do it on Excel. As long as you're kind of confident with working through like a big spreadsheet, and you know what you're doing, and you record all of what you've been working on, that it's not the end of the world. And then obviously Excel can also deduplicate stuff. It's because it's just text, it's just code. You can just tell it to delete stuff that's the same. If it's got the same title, same whatever, it's going to be the same thing coming up again. But I can understand that's not everyone's cup of tea, so I don't kind of actively recommend it to everyone. It's just something that I find easy because I've been doing Excel for so long. But yeah, so that's just kind of just so you've seen it and you know what it looks like and you're familiar with it. Obviously, once you use it for yourself, you'll kind of understand what it takes, and just getting a hand around it. There's nothing that will replace that, no matter how much I talk to you about it. But yeah, screening is a very simple process. I will put up on the next slide everything you need to know when it loads. That's it. It's the slide is loaded. This is everything. This is all you need to know. So we do screening in 3 stages: title, abstract, full text. At the first 2 stages, title and abstract, you can grade a paper 3 ways. So if it's a 0, you don't want it, it's terrible, you exclude. If it's a 1, it's a maybe, yeah, okay, it could be relevant, but the title of the abstract doesn't have enough information. We're waiting to read the next step and tell. And a 2 is, yeah, this is great, really, really amazing. Definitely going to want it, relevant, include. And then you take that paper straight through to the next step. Each step of screening, you do 2 authors do it separately and blinded, like they go off on their own and do it. And then once they're finished, they'll meet up. If there's any discrepancy or something that doesn't match up, a third reviewer will come in and weigh in. There's 2 ways that are acceptable. Some people will say, oh, it's got to be by consensus. So all 3 of you will kind of sit together and discuss and say, okay, yeah, we're happy that they should be excluded or included, because essentially one opinion has convinced the other one that their opinion is more valid. So let's say if 2 people, one said agree, one said disagree in terms of exclude, one wanted to exclude, one wanted to include, and the guy who excluded had a valid point regarding the inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria. And he was like, well, yeah, listen, you need to exclude this. It doesn't fit. If he can convince the other guy, then that's a consensus. Easy, no problem. The alternative way to do it is by just vote. So you've already had 2 votes. One said yes, one said no. The third guy just tie breaks. And they say, okay, well, it's 2-1. We're going to exclude it. That's it. Whichever is convenient to you guys, you do it how you want. Either is completely acceptable. Prisma will not, or like any other guideline. No, there's no kind of right way to do it. They're both completely valid. At the full text stage, there is no such thing as a maybe anymore, because you've read the paper. At this point, you kind of have to not be on the fence. You pick one. Either you've read the paper and you think it's relevant, or we've read the paper and no, we don't think it's relevant, and you get rid of it. That's it. So title and abstract, you can have a 0, 1, and a 2, and then for full text, it would just be a 0 or 1. It's either in or it's not. And that's pretty much it. Some studies will kind of say, oh, we only did abstract and full text. What they actually mean is they just combined title and abstract. I think that's a bit boring. It's also the hard way of doing it, because title can eliminate 90% of papers. I'm not even joking. 90% of papers will be eliminated by a good title screen, because you'll read the title and just think, this is not even the same field of medicine. Why is this here? These databases are so big, they're going to let in some irrelevant studies, and you can just, it takes 5 seconds to read the title and say, yeah, never mind, that wasn't relevant. So it's going to save you a lot of time if you just chop those away quickly, because then you're only reading abstracts that are relevant. So from a search of 2,000, you might only end up reading 300 abstracts, whereas otherwise the alternative is read all 2,000 abstracts. It's very tight, very tedious. It can take forever. And the fact that you're reading so much irrelevant work is going to put you off, to be honest. So don't do it. Just title first, because it will make your life easier. Yeah. And then to prove my point that that's all you need to know, this is from a paper I published like a couple months ago. When it loads. That's all we wrote. This is all we needed to write about the screening process. 3 investigators did it, and we did by title, abstract, review, and we did it on Rayan. And then when there was a disagreement, we got to a consensus. That's it. You write that in your manuscript. The rest is understood. It is very obvious what you did. Like, you can tell it was me and these 2 guys who did it, and that's it. But for context, you should write this. Like, in your manuscript, make sure you document which authors did that part. It's kind of like scientific accountability. When you do your paper, you want people to see what everyone in the team was doing. You want to see why that process was followed. Good scientific literature is one that is self-incorporating, in the sense that everything you write about, you can demonstrate what you did and why. So make sure that you include that, just for the case of everyone knows who did what, everyone can see, and it also keeps you guys accountable. Because theoretically, if someone was to ask for your research team to demonstrate what you did, you can then, theoretically, there should be a Rayan file with all 3 of our names on it, and we can just say, well, there you go, this is our screening. And someone who wants to verify it, or someone who tried to replicate our work but got a different screening outcome, we can then say, well, this is what we did, let's see how yours was different. And it's never happened. I can't think of a single case in all my time doing research that anyone has ever asked, but theoretically, good scientists need to be held accountable, because otherwise you could just publish whatever you want. So yeah, but that's it. This is 3 sentences. That's all you ever need to write in a manuscript. Don't overcomplicate this step. It is very simple. Screening is an easy job. All you need to do is make sure that your papers are included or excluded as per the inclusion exclusion criteria. If that means, if you find an article in Spanish and your inclusion criteria is English only, just get rid of it. Don't make that harder than it needs to be. That's literally it. Right. The next thing I want to talk to you about quite quickly is kind of documenting this process. So the way we do that is by something called a Prisma flowchart. It's essentially a summary of all the articles we found from our databases, and then how we navigated through them to get to the number that we included in our paper. So you've got to be able to account for where those papers came from, why you excluded some of them, and then what's left over. So again, I'll give you an example from a paper line. This is essentially it. Yeah. So we've got at the very top, you can kind of see all our inputs. So records we identified from Medline, Embase, Cochrane, and Scopus. That all comes in. And then now Medline and Embase are very similar. They both have a lot of overlapping journals. So you get a lot of duplicates. And then we eliminate that. Rayan can you just press a button. It just detect duplicates, press it, it does it for you. And then we're left with 1,138 records we screened. And then you eliminate. So by abstract screening, we eliminated 1,111 and we only read 27 full texts. So as you can see, 99% of articles are gone by the time we get to full text, because the vast majority of stuff that comes through in a database is irrelevant. Unfortunately, that's just the way they are. They're broad, but only you can know like how to make it deep and how to cover all the stuff, because you're the one who actually reads the full thing. The computer doesn't know what's in the paper. The computer just is just going to read, okay, like, well, this paper has the keyword you wanted, and it seems, maybe it's relevant, because that's all the computer is designed to do when you put your search in. You're the one who has to then say, well, let's read the thing and figure out whether it's relevant to me or not. So that process of going from 2,000 records at the start to 27 at full text and then 19 at synthesis, you're eliminating over 99% of papers you find. And that's why you really don't want to be wasting your time on that process. If you can whittle through it as quickly as possible, you'll be good. In a really like high level, like a Cochrane review or something, technically here at the where we've kind of put down full text articles excluded, where my mouse is, we would also like just specify why we excluded them. So it might be because they're the wrong study design, or they don't have the right outcomes, or whatever it is. We would just list like why we excluded them. It's kind of good practice to do that. Most of the time people don't, because out of convenience. But if you're doing like a really high quality piece of work and you want to like demonstrate that, that's really important, because then obviously you can show that like, well, I didn't include these papers because I don't think that X, Y, and Z is relevant. And it's kind of going above and beyond, which is really good, but it's not a requirement. You don't have to do that, but you should. I think it's important. But yeah, that's pretty much everything you need to know about screening. Like, genuinely, just finding the papers, getting them into like a Rayan or something, making sure that you're reading as per your inclusion exclusion criteria, and making sure the papers have the information you want, and then just being thorough and documenting all your findings. That's genuinely it. The one thing I can think of, by the way, this chart goes in your results section. A lot of people just assume it's in the methods. It's not. This is the first part of your results, because the way I like to explain this to people is the results section is what you will do in the future. It's all kind of hypothetical. While you're in the results section, everything you talk about is hypothetical. But when you got to this stage, you've done stuff. You found all those articles and read them. So now that you've done stuff, you got to document what you did, and that is a results part, because this is now you're actually doing stuff to get your study progressed, and then you're going to identify all these papers. You're going to write about them, like that. So this is now a result, because you're talking about what you're going to include, which is obviously the bulk of where your data comes from and where the evidence comes from. So yeah, make sure that at the very start of your results, you talk about this flow chart. You talk about where it came from. You talk about why you excluded the stuff you excluded, and what's going to be left over in your study. But yeah, that's pretty much everything you need to know about screening. Like that's genuinely everything. It's fairly straightforward. I think once you start to do it, you will appreciate how easy it is. But yeah, I'm happy to call that there. If anyone has any questions or anything, obviously I'm happy to take them at the end, or if there's like loads of stuff that's cropping up, I'm happy to pause for a bit. Jacob, what's going on?
So there's only one question actually, and that is, what would you say are the main benefits of Ryan to EndNote?
I don't like EndNote. It's not my cup of tea. Rayan is basically, I mean, EndNote people use more for like citation management. So like it can integrate all your citations into your manuscript, which is that's a really good use for it. I don't use it for that. To be honest, I kind of do hand citations still, and I've gotten really good at it. So it's probably easier for me to learn how to use EndNote. Again, I'm a little bit old school. But Rayan is really good because you can record all of your decisions for you and your team in one place. And you can, it's starting to get more AI integration. So sometimes the AI can give you like an opinion on the paper itself. There's this new feature they've developed where the AI can kind of try and read the abstract or whatever and give you what it thinks is relevant or not, because it will basically just searches for keywords. It's kind of like a neural like an NLP model, kind of like ChatGPT. It just searches for keywords. If it's got like a bunch of relevant words that were in your Pico or something, it will try and say, yeah, okay, well, we think that this is something you should include. But it's not perfect. But at least it's better than nothing for sure. So yeah, Rayan can take like sources from, like, you can put in as many databases as you want. It can handle like thousands of citations. It's very robust, and it's very popular. So if you tell any scientist you're using it, they'll probably be familiar with it, which is really good for like cross institutional working and stuff like that. So yeah, that's probably why I would use it. If I'm doing for stuff for myself, I'd still probably stick to Excel because it's, for me, it doesn't really matter. But yeah, in the modern day, I think it's useful to have at least one tool like that you can kind of share with people and stuff.
Yeah, nice. Well, that's the only question for that section.
Cool. Okay, so that's screening done. Obviously, if there's more questions or anything like that, I'll come back to it. But otherwise, we can kind of plot on to risk of bias. Again, this one's not too deep. The thing with risk of bias is that there's like a million permutations of it for every different type of study, every different type of bias. So it can get very niche. I'm going to kind of stick to the basic stuff in terms of doing like a trial or like an observational study, because that's what 99% of you guys are going to end up doing a mentorship, but also just most medical studies. If there's more niche stuff you want me to kind of talk through later with you, or something that comes up on a mentorship program, we will deal with that as it comes. So I'm happy to kind of go back to that stuff later. But for now, let's just do the bare bones, because this is what you'll need for the vast majority of your studies. So yeah. So essentially what this slide and what I wanted to say was, well, okay, you know what studies you're going to include because you've just finished screening. But now we need to know, are those data studies any good? Because the quality of your systematic review meta-analysis and the quality of the evidence you produce is only as good as the studies, right? If your studies are all really terrible, like cohort studies with a bunch of bias, your results from combining all of them together cannot, by definition, be any better. Like, you are the sum of what you start with, if that makes sense. So in order to assess that, we need to know what our building blocks are and how good they are. So the way we're going to do that, first off, is I think let's have a conversation very briefly about what bias is. People get this wrong a lot. Bias, they kind of assume that bias is, like you have like confirmation bias or whatever. And those are types of bias, but they are themselves not bias. There's the way I kind of like to explain it is it's kind of like bias is if I'm trying to hit a bullseye and I miss in a certain direction, that direction I miss in is bias. But the process that caused me to veer off my target is the type of bias that did that. So and I've given the definition here. So bias is introduced by systemic error in research. It leads to an outcome becoming more selective than another, beyond what can be expected in natural observation. So if you're expecting that, A is going to be 10 times better than B, but you're only seeing it be 5 times better than B, something is boosting up the scores for B or lowering them for A. And the question is why? So that's where you've got to think about, are we measuring something wrong? Are we looking at something the wrong way? Why are we not getting the natural result in our experiment or our study? So an example I've put here is, let's say you've got a randomized control trial that is poorly blinded. So participants might know what arm of the study they're in. They might know that they're in the interventional arm, or they might know that they're in the placebo arm. So you might find that, well, people in the placebo arm, they don't want the placebo to be thought of as good. So they're just going to like underestimate how good it is. And, they're going to say that, oh, it's useless, it doesn't do anything. Or equally, people want that drug to be better for them. So they're going to overestimate how good it is and how useful it is. So, and then when a participant does that, the end result on the research is that we as a researcher will see that the treatment effect is being massively overestimated because the treatment arm looks so much better than the placebo arm. But that's not what is the natural result, because actually that difference is overestimated compared to what it is in real life. So that's that direction of movement where, the recorded estimate and the actual estimate are not the same. That movement and that deviation from the truth is bias. And that's important, because if you have bias in the studies within your paper and then you do a review of all of them, you're just going to have, you're going to have bias seeping through all of them at the same time. So that bias will compound. And if you're not aware of why that is and where it comes from, that's going to be dangerous. So it's important that we study this really well and we know what that comes from. So the way I like to think about this is, well, risk of bias is basically the same as critical appraisal. Your job essentially here is to identify types of bias, and it is to also identify what that's going to do to the papers you're going to include in your systematic review meta-analysis. Because again, like we said, the strength of your meta-analysis and your systematic review is only as good as the studies you've mentioned within it. So to keep this really simple, we can kind of cover what kind of studies and what kind of tools we use. I'm gonna not go into the overcomplicated details, although I have unfortunately had to do that in other studies. It's a pain. This can get really, really messy depending on what kind of things you're studying, and different types of studies have different risk of bias tools. But the most obvious kind of case uses that you're going to find are RCTs and observational studies. So RCTs are like the most overstudied one. They have probably the most robust tool as well, the one that's like most popular, most commonly used, which is the risk of bias 2 tool from the Cochrane group. I will kind of break these down as well. So I've got like a bunch of screenshots explaining how we use them and how we'd apply them, and then how to kind of demonstrate how to portray these within a paper as well. So I'll talk through all of that, and it should hopefully start to make sense and come more clear. But yeah, so that's the first half. The second half is for observational. You can use some called so the Cochrane one is called Robbins 1, which is like the risk of bias for non-randomized studies. That one's a little bit clunky to use. The easier tool that I like is the Newcastle Ottawa scale. It's more manageable. It's work to do, and to be honest, like bustness in terms of the questions is not that dissimilar. It's fairly manageable. So yeah, whichever floats your boat is completely fine. Similar things. But yeah, let's start off by talking through Rob 2, just kind of briefly. So Rob 2 has 5 main kind of mechanisms of identifying bias, and the 5 biggest biases that they kind of came across. The first one is randomization, which makes obvious sense. I mean, if your sample isn't randomized, then you didn't even do an RCT properly, so that's obviously going to cause bias. The second one is from deviation from intended intervention. This one is basically just blinding. People kind of get too bogged down in the details, which I will get into because there's 2 different types of deviation. But yeah, essentially it's just, are you in the right group all the time, and does that affect how we do? Then missing outcome data. It's kind of the oldest trick in the book, to be honest, with trials. Is just, well, things get lost, people get missed out in the trial. What do we do? Do we just not report them, or do we just do half an analysis and just kind of try and continue? So that's intention to treat, by the way. Measurement of outcome, like if you measure different things in different patients and it can get really ugly. You want to show that you're consistent. You want to show that you're measuring the same thing every time. And then selection of the reported result. Again, if you have 10 variables and only 3 of them are significant, you just happen to report those 3. Well, all of a sudden, your patients are going to look very sick. But that's not necessarily what was true, because the other 7 were no different. So what you're doing is, by artificially only selecting to report some outcomes, you can start to bias how the comparison looks between the 2. And that's not fair. And that's going to introduce bias, because you're literally moving where the bullseye is and just saying you hit an arbitrary target, which is obviously going to cause bias. So depending on what you find in the text, and you have to answer this only depending on what you find in the text, there are 5 responses. So you can say yes, potentially yes, no, potentially no, and not enough information. Cochrane are really, really good with this stuff. They basically break down everything for you when it comes to how to do the Rob2 tool and what to fill in. And they even kind of tell you, like, okay, bias from randomization seems like a very abstract concept, but they'll tell you what to look for in the paper as well. And it's done in the form of really helpful kind of questions that you can answer along the way. So I'm going to kind of pick out, I've put a bunch of screenshots of the guidance from Cochrane in here, and I can talk through that with you, and then it will start to make sense of what you're looking for. Once you can identify these things within a paper, it will really all click together. So if you're doing mentorship, this stuff will become more obvious. But yeah, so to start off with, this is these are all the template from the Cochrane handbook and the tool, the Rob2 tool. So you can literally see this being used. And so when you look at randomization, the main thing you want to look at is the allocation sequence. So essentially, this should basically just be a bunch of random numbers. And this should, it should be a bunch of random numbers that dictate whether a participant ends up in the control group or the intervention group. And nobody should know what this is. The patient shouldn't know, and especially like the doctor or whoever's treating them should definitely not know. Because if there's a problem with this, what you're going to find is, like what 1.3 suggests, is that there will be differences in the baseline. Because theoretically, right, if everyone gets allocated as per pure chance, you could be in either group and you will never know. So because of that, you have to automatically assume that in a perfectly random world, the baseline characteristics, age, gender, everything in both groups should be perfectly equal, because anyone could end up in any group. So there's no chance of a difference. But if there is an obvious difference, if you're finding that like all the young people in one group and all the old group, then clearly someone's tampered with it. There's something that's gone wrong there. So if there's something obviously kind of causing that discrepancy, you'd say, well, hang on, yes, like there's gap here, and you can put down in the comments and say, well, the baseline characteristics are like massively skewed. So in the text, you literally are going to look for these questions and just look for the answers, and if they're there, you write that down. And then as a result of that, you give a risk of bias judgment. So your risk of bias judgment is done by domain. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 all get a risk of bias judgment. And because of that, you're going to give the study an end judgment as well. So in this case, let's say you said allocation sequence is random. Great. It's random and nobody knew about it. So yes and yes. Great. That's really good. And then you're going to say, well, was there any baseline differences between the groups? Well, you look through the tables in the paper and you say, well, there was nothing obvious. So you say no. So in that case, you would say, well, this looks really good. There's nothing obviously wrong. So we're going to say low risk of bias. And then the optional stuff, direction of bias, doesn't mean anything, because you just say, well, NA, we don't think there's that much bias. And you leave it there. And that's your domain 1 done. Like, this can be done, you just, it will be at the start. In any trial, this will be like at the very start of the method section. They'll tell you, trialists were randomized by 1-to-1 ratio under such and such protocol, and they'll just tell you immediately. This will be like the first paragraph or the second paragraph of the method section. It won't be like lost in the details somewhere. But the difficulty with trials is that because of brevity, they don't always record this stuff. They'll just kind of be like, oh, it's in the protocol somewhere. And yeah, you can go check, but it's extra work. So that's where you've got to be a bit mindful. So that's domain 1. Domain 2, there's 2 types of these ones. One is in gold, very fancy. But these are very notably different, only in one way. So the gold one is deviations from the intervention, effect of adhering to intervention. So this is for something where the intervention is ongoing. So maybe it's like an exercise regime, or it's something where you have to stay in the same group of, like, you're either in the control group for a really long time or you're in the intervention group for a really long time. And in that case, is there going to be an issue where like your blinding fails halfway through, or like it becomes obvious that you're not adhering to that intervention? So that's where you use the gold one. The other one, the normal, the kind of one, this one is called effective assignment to intervention. So that's, you get assigned to a group once, and I don't know, you have a surgery or something, and that's it, you're done. After that, what group you're in, like, the assignment is just a one-time thing. So yeah, again, here the main questions are 2.1, 2.2, and then from there you kind of fit in what you are. So if 2.1, if participants were aware of their assigned intervention, that means they weren't blinded. And if carers and people delivering, it means they weren't blinded. So in a double-blinded trial, you should say no to both of them. If it's a single-blinded trial, you're going to say yes to the one that wasn't blinded and no to the one that was. And if it's an open-label trial, there's no blinding at all, you're going to say yes to both. If you say yes to both, then the question is, well, does a lack of blinding lead to deviation, and does that affect the outcome? Maybe it does. That's a cause of bias. And then, was there an appropriate analysis to estimate the effect of assignment intervention? Most of the time, not really. So, this is where a lot of studies start having bias, or like at least some concerns, because very few studies do both double blinding and analysis to cover. It's just too much effort and it's challenging to do. So a lot of studies fall through the cracks here. But again, this stuff is stuff that will be obvious in the methods. Fairly early on in the methods, they'll tell you like the type of blinding they did, how they pulled it off. And in the method section, when it comes to analysis and like data reporting, they will tell you, what was the analysis used to estimate this. So it should be quite apparent to you reading the method section that this stuff was true or not. And then your risk of bias judgment comes naturally from there. This is, if you read this, they're almost the same. The only difference here is they've kind of said, were important, non-important balanced across intervention groups, and then were the failures in implementing that intervention. So potentially, non-protocol interventions can be introduced, but that gets really complicated because you don't know what those are. You don't know if they're mentioned. They're basically, it's kind of improvising along the way. At that point, you're already off the track. Something's gone wrong, blinding is broken. So, or maybe someone had like a medical emergency or something, and you're basically just filling in the gap by adding in something new to the trial. So that's kind of already something's gone wrong. So it's not very commonly reported or seen in trials. So don't worry about it unless you see it. But again, Cochrane are really good. They have like extensive guidance on this stuff in the guideline books. So if you need it, you can always find more information, but it rarely comes up. The main questions, like I said, 2.1, 2.2, and then 2.6 regarding analysis. That's kind of the bulk of it, what you need to cover now. 2.3, three, I should say. Domain 3 is missing outcome data. Was all the outcome data available? It's a pretty easy question. You just say either yes or no. And almost entirely, you're going to say yes. Like almost most modern trials, the vast majority of them, you'll get data for everything. And if they don't tell you if they don't have data for something for some reason, they will kind of report that to you and be like, by the way, we don't have study for these guys because they dropped out of the trial, or whatever, someone died, something. They'll tell you. And that should be fairly obvious. And then because if you have this, you don't need to answer the rest of them. So it's automatically like a low risk of bias. You only go into 3.2, 3.3, 3.4 if you need to, and you're finding that, well, yeah, now that we know that there's missing data, like how much was missing, how can we identify that was a big deal? Was there any attempt to account for it in the analysis, like an intention to treat model or something? That's when it gets complicated. But the vast majority of trials, you just say, yeah, pretty much everything was there, and it will be. So they're fairly straightforward. But again, it should be obvious in the method section. When they talk about their data analysis, they will tell you what their plan is to do with missing data. They will cover this quite in depth because it's often a requirement for funding to talk about, well, okay, you spent all of our money collecting this data. What if you miss something? So it's very rarely like not reported at all. Cool. Then the next domain 4, risk of bias in the measurement. This one's a bit subjective. I mean, was the method of measuring it appropriate? It depends. If they did something that's obviously just not like industry standard, you'd say, well, hang on, why did you do that? Or maybe they just didn't mention it. They just neglected to report that. Again, might be like for brevity in the results section or something. You got to go, hang on, why did you just not mention it? Was it because there's something you did wrong, or is it because you just don't want to waste words on it, tight word count? It depends. Could measurement of ascertainment of the outcome have differed between intervention groups? Again, that's something like, it's a bit subjective, but if it's very obvious that the same protocol has been followed, stuff has been done the same way, it's in the same hospital or something, then it's not to worry about. It's going to be the same. If no to both, then you kind of think, well, hang on, were outcome assessors aware of the intervention? Like, was that why? And could the assessment of the outcome have been influenced by that? Because if you know what the outcome is and you know how you're measuring it, then a biased researcher could just influence it to whatever they want it to be, right? They can just maneuver things. So that's where you've got to think about, hang on, like what's going on there and why was that done a certain way? I need one interview. Cool. I'll do that myself in a second. Okay. Risk of bias judgment. So yeah. And then the last one, this one's very straightforward. Were the data produced as per a pre-specified analysis plan that was finalized before? So did they have a protocol that was good? Yes or no? Did they pick a result that may have come from multiple within the same domain? Often it's very obvious. It's if there are like 10 ways of reporting the same thing and they chose a weird one, why did they do that? Or something like that. But again, these are the second two, 5.2 and 5.3 are subjective. It's depend. This is where you should also be aware of like how things are done in that industry. If you're looking at like a cardiac trial and there are set ways of things being done with cardiac measurements, be familiar with how that's done, because then you won't be caught out by something that doesn't look right. But to be honest, again, for funding reasons and for, a lot of scientists do things the same way for convenience. So this stuff is not that often done weirdly. A lot of the time, these are very routine. And having a protocol that like pre-specifies analysis is also very common. Again, a lot of funding isn't even given without it. So this is very rarely like a hill to die on in terms of a cause of bias. But it can be done very poorly, as you can imagine. If there's just no protocol and everyone's just improvising, it can go horribly wrong. So make sure you do double check this. But yeah, so if you've done all of these, you should have a risk of bias for each domain. And then you just kind of basically, you want to go with like a consistent average, or alternatively, sometimes you can go with like what the lowest one is. So if you have, let's say 3 of them are some concerns and 2 of them are low, I think you kind of say, well, the risk of bias is some concerns for that study, because more often than not, you have something to worry about. So yeah, if there's one domain that is high risk of bias, that whole study is condemned, unfortunately, like, because once there's one area that introduces bias, the rest of it doesn't make up for it, like if you're steering away from the bullseye, like you're gonna miss anyway. So that's it. Like once you miss one, you're pretty much almost always going to give a high to that paper if one of these is a high. But yeah, now obviously these are like really complicated tables, and as you can imagine, doing this 100 times for a big meta-analysis can be a pain. So you've got to have a nice way to report this that's easily going to fit in your manuscript. The way we do that is so Cochrane and Rob, they have this tool called RobViz. It's really, really helpful. I put a screenshot of it on the screen right now. Basically, it's just a really concise, intricate way to get all your risk of bias into these kind of tables. Into these kind of tables here. So it covers domain 1, 2, 3, and 5, and an overall judgment, and that's it. Like that is very neatly kind of going to contain everything that you're talking about into one place for all the C's. And then obviously you can put that in the supplement of your manuscript or something, and you can talk about it and say, well, out of the 15 papers in my meta-analysis, 10 of them had high risk of bias, 5 of them were low, and that's it. And then you can obviously refer them to the table, demonstrate where that bias comes from in each domain. So it's a very nice kind of summarizing way to put together all that information. But RobViz is really good because you can literally just feed in all the data. So if you click on that upload data tab on the top, it will take you to this screen here. Essentially, this screen will tell you, basically, you click on the tool you want, and then you can feed in an Excel sheet. Like if you put in all of these, like study D1, D2, D3, D4, D5, and overall, you can just make a simple Excel sheet and just write that all down, and it will create it for you. Alternatively, like on the left, it's cut off on my screenshot because it says if you wish to explore the app's functionality on the very bottom left. Just under there, there's something called like edit manually, and you can just like click edit, and just manually put them all in if that's easier, if your Excel is not working or something. So RobViz kind of gives you like both ways of doing it, which is really helpful. And then you get your Rob2 and you just insert that straight into your manuscript. And for if you have only risk of bias of trials, that's you done. Some people recommend that they should say, they say kind of only do risk of bias for like trials, because, you know, as in, sorry, only include trials in your meta-analysis, because they say, well, that's more methodologically pure. Trials are most likely to be the best evidence. I don't agree with that. I think you're missing out on a ton of data if you're not doing it. And obviously, you're going to know what the bias is from everything. If you really want to, you can do like a trials only analysis and then a like observational study only analysis or something. But I think just entirely exclude is a bit reductionist. But again, people have their own preferences, and stuff like Cochrane, yeah, they'll definitely not bother with observational. They're trial only because they think that the purity of the study going in dictates the purity of the thing going out, and they're very strict on that. So it's personal preference combined with where you're at in terms of how much you want to include in your meta-analysis, how important you think your results are. There's a little bit of leeway around there. Now, but that's enough about like the risk of bias for trials. For the observational side of things, it's a lot simpler. It is much easier. There are only 3 domains you want to know about here: selection, comparability, and outcome. And the way we do this, instead of doing the whole yes, no, maybe no kind of stuff, we just give them a number of stars depending on whether a study meets criteria in each domain. So again, Newcastle Ottawa has like a really helpful PDF document that explains everything, so it makes your life very simple. I've put all the screenshots in the next slide, so you'll be able to see it all, and I'll talk you through something. But let's just go. So this is the first one when it loads up. So selection is broken down into 4 questions for cohort studies. You give 1 star for every question within the sections. For comparability, there's only 1 question, but there's 2 stars available for it. So selection, as I will I hope you understand, but I'm happy to talk through. With a cohort study, you have an exposed cohort. So you have, let's say, an overall population. Out of that overall population, you're going to make a cohort of people that are entirely exposed with whatever thing you're studying, and then you're going to have a cohort of people that don't have it, and then you're going to compare, and you're going to study the differences between the two. And because it's an observational study, you're not going to do an intervention, you're just going to study, and you're just going to check through what the details are. So in this case, the things that get you the stars those are the only ways in which you can earn a star. So if it's representativeness of the exposed cohort, we need to see that it's either truly representative of whatever the disease is or somewhat representative. And if we don't believe that that's the case, we cannot give it a star. And then the non-exposed cohort needs to come from the same community as the exposed cohort, because otherwise you're not comparing like for like. If I compare a bunch of Japanese cardiac patients with healthy British patients, that's a useless comparison because they're not the same, and their starting points are not the same. So it's not going to mean anything. You've got to compare like with like, because you're not even able to do any intervention here. So you just need to see whether, ideally, the only thing you want to be changing is whether they have the disease or not, and that's it, because you can't intervene and do anything other than that. So picking the right cohort in a cohort study is kind of going to make or break your study. Ascertainment of exposure, it's got to be something that's replicable, because otherwise you're going to introduce bias in that people might say different things, or it might not be reliable. So secure records such as like medical records, that's one, or alternatively, it's like a structured interview. So something where, they've sat down with an independent third party and given consistent answers. Self-report doesn't count because you can make the same report and give 5 different answers. So that's going to introduce bias because that result won't be the same and you're going to end up skewing your result. You cannot verify its validity either. So, and then the last thing is demonstration the outcome of internet was not present at the start of the study. So if you're studying something like disease progression, you need to know that at the start that disease didn't exist. It's, because otherwise, what's the point of your study? You're trying to identify a change over time, but you didn't see a change because it was already there. So again, you're going to introduce bias because instead of moving towards the bullseye, apparently you're already there. Your whole study stops making sense. So you need to see something in the literature that tells you that, I don't know, the baseline characteristics were distinctly different from what it was at the end of the study, or something that shows you that things have changed over time. The next one is comparability. This one, as you'll notice, is just one question. It's very, very easy. So comparability of cohorts on the basis of design or analysis. So the study will control for multiple things that will determine whether the cohorts are the same or not. So it needs to control for 2 things at the very minimum. Otherwise, it's probably wrong. Like there's something going wrong there. But ideally 2, it might be 1. So you get a star for each. And this is the only time you do this in Newcastle, Ottawa. Otherwise, it's just a star for like for example, if we go back, structured record and secured interview. Sorry, secure record and structured interview doesn't get 2 stars. You get 1 star for either because that's how you measured it. Whereas here, you need to show that there was one factor being controlled and then another factor being controlled. So that might be that all the patients were of the same age and gender, or maybe they were from this, they had the same comorbidities and something else. So as long as you can verify that those 2 important factors that were controlled to make sure that the cohorts are as close to identical as possible and comparable, then that means you can give them both stars. And then the very last one is outcome. This one is very straightforward. It's very common sense kind of stuff. So assessment of outcome, you need to see something that's going to demonstrate that outcome, like black and white. So record linkage, hospital record is unarguable. If it says the guy died, they died. That's it. Like you have a record that is set in stone. And then independent blind assessment means it kind of says what it does on the tin. If the guy had an assessment and it was done by an unknowing assessor who kind of can be trusted to be non-biased and independent, they have no way of knowing what group you're in, so they're not gonna have any partiality to one group or the other. So you can be confident that even if they repeated the measurement, they're independent. They should do the same thing again. Was follow-up period long enough for outcomes to occur? This is obviously dependent slightly upon context. So for example, if you're studying a surgery and you want to see short-term hospital outcomes are often done at 30-day interval. So that's what we call an in-hospital period. So if you have a follow-up of 10 days, that's not enough. You'd say no. But if you have 6 months of follow-up and then they've done an analysis of 30 days, you'd say, well, yeah, fair enough. You had 6 months of data. You also happen to do a kind of a separate analysis of 1 month's data. Fair enough. You do what you want. That's fine. So depending on what the outcome is, the question is it reasonable that happened within that time? And depending on what it is, you've got to kind of make that subjective call of yes, it is, or no, it wasn't. Adequacy of follow-up. So the ideal metric is obviously complete follow-up. So you follow up everybody. And then alternatively, you can also give a star for a small number of people that are lost due to follow-up, because you might miss people, or they might move, or they might die, or things happen, right? So and this is slightly subjective. So I've seen studies where we've done risk of bias and we've said, well, 5% will allow because you can't control that. If it's much worse than that, we're not gonna give you the score. Because I mean, 5% is like a reasonable amount to lose, right? Like in 1,000 patients, you can't follow up. You lose 50, you end up with 950. Fair enough, no problem. But if you end up with like 600, you'd be like, hang on, why did half your sample disappear? So you've got to kind of question within reason what's acceptable and what isn't. And also, again, this is something that they should obviously cover in the method section. They should tell you, like, this is how we try to follow up people, this is how long we followed them for, and this is what we did when we lost someone. And a good study will tell you in the method section exactly how they did this. They will have a section talking about where the outcomes came from, what the duration of follow-up was, and why it was that long. A good study will cover all of these things within its methods, and if not within the methods, then with the baseline characteristics of the methods results section. So within those two sections, you'll find all the information you need for the risk of bias, because that's fundamentally what you're going to be measuring. You're going to measure whether they did what they said they were going to do and whether they actually did it. That's it. That's how you identify bias. And so this is from a study I'm doing. It's just kind of like how you would characterize this within a manuscript. So like you just put down stars as applicable for each study. And then obviously by the end, you're going to have, it's going to be out of 9 because 4, 2, and then 3 is 9. So obviously if they get a bunch of stars for everything, then the risk of bias is really low. If they miss out stuff and they're not getting that many stars, the risk of bias is high. So depending on what the score is, you kind of adjust. Yeah. To be honest, you wouldn't really give low risk of bias to a lot of studies because fundamentally, it's just very difficult for it's not common to see studies get everything right. So pretty much all of them are going to be moderate, if not worse, unfortunately. But yeah, so something like this, it just kind of collates everything in a tidy little table. And again, you can put that in your manuscript somewhere and you can talk about it. You can say, well, I don't know, Barbanti et al., they had a moderate one because of X, Y, and Z. And you can talk about the details of why certain studies got knocked down on stuff, which is really helpful. I think that's pretty much everything I had to cover today. Yeah. If there's any questions, anything you want to know, I'm going to be around for a few minutes, but then obviously I'll take questions and stuff later as well. Obviously, chances are a lot of you guys will be doing this in the mentorship scheme. So at that point, you'll get to see for yourself what it's like to try this in a real study. But yeah, thanks for listening, guys.
Brilliant. Thanks, Niraj. There aren't any further questions yet. Can I just remind everybody to please fill in both feedback forms to get your final certificate? I've put them both in the chat. I don't think there are any more questions. So
Yeah, I got that feeling too.
are you happy for me to end it there?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.